Excellent. Oh, that was so good. I just I love the detail of those letters and the personal stories. And one of our sharp teachers caught something that was kind of connected to a presentation that we heard a few weeks ago from Brian Lusky of West Virginia University. And he didn't give us all the great background he did on the Grimke sisters, but he did tell us the story of how after the Weld Grimke wedding happened, that Philadelphia Hall was burned. And so I wonder if you want to say a little bit about that. And I guess the larger question connected to that is just how radical these people were. And I think sometimes we imagine the North, was some kind of perfect place, but it definitely wasn't. I mean, it was very racist and resistant to, these causes as well. So anyways, I
No,
think there's a question there
absolutely.
somewhere.
I'm happy to talk about that. And actually, I think that's where a lot of scholarship is going these days, is that the South was clearly like the focus of the anti-slavery movement, and then later in the civil rights movement as the sort of home of Jim Crow and segregation and lynching. And the North kind of got this pass for everything it was doing because it was not the South. And so just by comparison, it was a lot better, And now people are saying, okay, we get it. Of all that, we're not letting the South off the hook, but we're taking a look at you, North, and we're seeing some things that aren't so great. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on in the North, and this is true in all time periods. So in this time period, and particularly, there's a lot of look at sundown towns in the 20th century and the practice of Midwestern towns like Oshkosh, which I've done a little bit of research on with my students, and it's pretty unsavory what we're finding here. But yeah, the burning of Pennsylvania Hall was really terrible. I would like to put in a plug for an excellent book by a woman named Carol Faulkner, who's an old friend of mine, who wrote a biography of Lucretia Mott that has a whole chapter on Pennsylvania Hall, which is really fantastic. Um, I think it was sort of this dream of the anti-slavery societies in Philadelphia, and they raised a lot of money and they put a lot of money into it, and it was a long time, building it and everything. And they had a lot of meetings in there, and the meetings were promiscuous. There were black and white and male and female. And pretty early on, they didn't have many meetings in there. A mob formed, and there was a rumor that there was an interracial couple there, but it was just right, Angel. If you heard the story, the Grimke Welds had a black minister and guests at their wedding, and the mayor was totally useless. Like, this might hit a little too close to home. Everyone knows a mob is coming to do some damage, and the political structure of the town does not stop it or prevent it. And so, the mob burned down the hall. And Lucretia Mott had kind of an interesting thing there. Again, she's this respectable, tiny woman, and one of the leaders of the mob, like think a Proud Boy or an Oath Keeper, was kind of rampaging around. And she went right up to him and said, "Oh, I need some help. I know you won't let me come to any harm." So she basically appealed to a sense of chivalry and gallantry, and he immediately stuck out his arm and escorted her down the street. So she had this like amazing ability to neutralize, even though it's like raving lunatics out there. But it did burn down, and some of the mob went to Lucretia Mott's house intending harm, and they were able to sort of stave them off. But the mob also went and burned a black orphanage and a black hospital. So it was a really terrible situation. And mobs also burned down, I think it's Elijah Lovejoy's press in maybe it's Ohio, maybe it's Akron. But yeah, abolitionists were extremely controversial and often attacked wherever they went. I told that story of Frederick Douglass saying, "No more with the nine violence. Anyone hits me, I'm hitting back."
So yeah, no, thank you so
terrible.
much. That just helps to connect that story so well. A few more quick questions, and then we'll get into our breakout rooms. Ernest asks a really great question, kind of making an analogy to what you're talking about, how these different rights movements built upon each other, and how that we see that in the 20th century too, with the civil rights movement inspiring things like the gay rights movement, the idea that people with disabilities should have rights. And would you buy that analogy?
No, absolutely. That's actually the way it was taught to me as an undergraduate in the 1980s, way back when. That there's absolutely this parallel. If you're familiar with the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, who famously wrote Souls of Black Folk, was one of the founding members of the NAACP, he wrote a lot of things. I actually spent a year or two trying to read everything he wrote, and that was a busy, busy year. But one of the things he wrote is this really nice book called The Gift of Black Folk, where he basically makes the proposition that it's Black people and their commitment to rights and liberty and freedom that actually made America what it is. That America was had these great ideas, but were very limited and narrow in their application of them. And it's actually Black liberation movements that have held America to a higher standard and kind of forced them not just to end anti-Black racism, but to also, like you said, inspire all these other reforms. And absolutely, this is a great way to parallel what happens in the post-World War II era with the civil rights movement, and then same kind of connections, a lot of the same people, a lot of the same ideologies when you're thinking about rights and oppression and everything. And also some of the same methodologies that people who learned nonviolent activism in the civil rights movement applied it to the women's movement. And even the like consciousness raising that comes out of rap sessions in the civil rights movement that, famously they would stay up all night to kind of talk and hash things out. And they didn't want too much hierarchy or too much, one leader telling everyone what to do. And then a lot of women took those rap sessions and applied them to women getting together, and that became women's consciousness raising groups. And even there's also connections with Black power and women's liberation. The idea of we're kind of frustrated with integration. We're getting a little burned out from that. So let's focus on our own communities. And then women's liberation is kind of in some ways saying we don't want to listen to men or deal with them anymore. So we're going to talk to ourselves and think about ourselves and have these consciousness raising sessions. So there's absolutely a connection between civil rights and Black power and women's liberation.
Great. And then there was a question about that last image you had of the Am I Not a Sister also, and that, kind of as a play on the original Am I Not a Brother. And did Josiah Wedgwood also design the Am I Not a Sister, or is that just someone who came along and kind of changed that?
I actually don't know, and that's horribly embarrassing. I actually had a wonderful student who's now in graduate school who actually studied that image and wrote a beautiful paper on it, and also did a lot of other things. And I really should know that. So I'm sorry I don't. But it's a really powerful image and really says a lot about the concept of sisterhood.
We'll work on that one with the Googler.
Okay.
And,
yeah, right.
And then I want Kelsey has usefully put the link to the book that you mentioned. And then I want to just mention, I want to throw a question out there that maybe we can address after the breakout rooms, because I think it's such a good question. It's so rich, but it's big. So I think we need to kind of chew on it. And so Marissa asks us, if the abolitionist movement and women's rights movements were operating concurrently, why did the women's suffrage movement take another 60 years to reach the 19th Amendment? Great question.
I blame Catherine Beecher. I really do. So you saw that image, there's this ongoing tension in women's history of women not agreeing on, or let me back up, of a lot of women agreeing that they're not happy with the present situation and they think women should have more power in society, but they don't agree on whether women should argue for more power on the basis of their equality with men, on their similarity with men, or on the basis of their difference with men. And there's actually quite a lot of women like Catherine Beecher and others in the 19th century who think, no, our power is in the separate spheres. Our power is in sort of the power behind the throne. And there's a kind of interesting case to be made that they actually, for the first time, have something they control in the home that gives them moral power in the home and enables them to actually I don't know how far in the weeds you want me to get and I don't know how much you can talk about this with your students in middle school and high school, but there's a 150-year decline in birth rates from 1800 to until the baby boom. And most people think that's accomplished through abstinence. And it's women who control that because they have this separate sphere and they control the home, they control the family, and then they control the sexual relationships, that they're able to tell their husbands, we're going to take a 2 or 3 year break and then we can pick this back up. Harriet Beecher Stowe actually writes a letter like that to her husband, Calvin Stowe. We have 3 kids, I can't deal with anymore. And it's clear that they don't have any kids for a few years, but then they have some more. So it's clear that, they're capable, but she consciously tells them that's it. And during that space, she writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we're pretty sure that Mary Todd Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln did the same thing, that both of them had lost their mothers at an early age and were sort of heartbroken growing up as children. because their mothers died in childbirth or whatever, and didn't want that fate for their kids. So they clearly like spaced out their kids so that wouldn't happen. So this is just for me to say, like, some women said, like, hey, we have this thing we control: the house, the domestic space, the kids, the marital relationships, and consequently prostitution rates skyrocketed in this time period. So so some women are saying, like, we don't want equality, we want this thing that we have. And so the women who are arguing for equality with men, I mean, they're on the outs even within women's circles.
Wow.
And that's true in the suffrage movement as well, that temperance is far more popular than suffrage. Like Florence Frankie, who's the head of the temperance movement, Frances Willard, she was a far more powerful individual than the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement were like arguing amongst themselves about race and couldn't get out of their own way on that. But even in the early 20th century, this is what kills the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1920s, that a lot of labor leaders had argued for protective labor legislation for women on the basis of their difference from men. It's the Supreme Court case Muller versus Oregon in the early 20th century that gets women protections where they couldn't get them for men even. But they argued that women were weaker, and because they had babies, the state had an interest in protecting their bodies, and so they shouldn't work 12 hours a day in a hot factory. The state should be able to limit their hours. So all these protective labor legislation laws are passed in the early 20th century on that basis. And consequently, that opens the door for protective labor legislation for men in the 1930s, that Americans get used to the idea of labor laws because women pioneered it. But then in the 1920s, when Alice Paul introduces the Equal Rights Amendment, a lot of prominent female labor leaders and others say, we don't want that. That's going to kill all of our protective labor legislation that's predicated on women being different from men. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that women are divided on arguing whether they're very similar to men or whether they're very different and thus should be treated differently.
Wow. I'm glad you took that up. I'm glad we went into the weeds on that. It really
okay. Right.
Terrific. So let's talk about the document that the teachers are going to look at, and then